Let's do session 2 from shadow to substance. And so I realize we're covering a lot of ground. These first 2 sessions, the reason behind that is because most of this stuff that I've said so far is not disagreed on. Okay, there's some stuff I said in the first session that's disagreed on, but I'm gonna come back to that in session 3. So, but this second session is where we're going to try to press on into some of those practical implications a little bit. And I want to do that by starting in Hebrews chapter 4. So, no surprise there, we're going to be looking at Hebrews chapter 4, verses 1 to 11. And give everyone a moment to turn there, but if someone wants to read that, I know it's a longer section, but Hebrews chapter 4, verse 1 through 11. Great.
Therefore, let us fear if, while a promise remains of entering his rest, any one of you may seem to have come short of it. For indeed, we have had good news preached to us, just as they also. But the word they heard did not profit them, because it was not united by faith in those who heard. For we who have believed enter that rest, just as he has said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest, although his works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he has said somewhere concerning the seventh day, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again, in this passage, they shall not enter my rest. Therefore, since it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly had good news preached to them failed to enter because of disobedience, he again fixes a certain day. Today, saying through David after so long a time, just as has been said before, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, he would not have spoken of another day after that. So there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For the one who has entered his rest has himself also rested from his works, as God did from his. Therefore, let us be diligent to enter that rest, so that no one will fall, through following the same example of disobedience. Great.
So if you're following the logic of Hebrews, and if we were doing an expository series, this is actually like a third of what was called a pericope. So it starts towards the end of chapter 3, and it goes on a few more verses than what we've read. But I'm just trying to zoom in, both for the sake of time and for the sake of making a point, to see the specific reference that we have here. So in this passage, you have the idea of rest, entering rest. What is this rest? There remains a rest. And most poignantly, we have this in verse 9. So there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. So what on earth is the author of Hebrews getting on about? Well, no surprise, the author of Hebrews is arguing from the Old Testament to the New how Christ is the fulfillment of all things. Right? So famously, later in Hebrews, you'll see that the whole ceremonial, sacrificial, Levitical priesthood system is consummated in Christ's final sacrifice. That's why we don't do any more sacrifices, right? Because the once for all sacrifice has been made. So we don't need to go on sacrificing the blood of bulls and goats, because the perfect sacrifice has entered the perfect Holy of Holies. He has fulfilled all things. So what's he talking about here? He's talking about an Old Testament thing, the Sabbath, and what it pointed to. It pointed to Christ. It pointed to the rest that Christ brings. Or in other words, the Sabbath was teaching the people of God, by their resting from their works, that what they're really supposed to figure out is that God is going to provide an ultimate rest from work by fulfilling the law himself and bringing about this rest and causing us to enter that rest. So, when we enter that rest, we rest from our works just as God rested from his works. And therefore, we should strive to enter that rest. And of course, in view is heaven. And this might not be so apparent, but it talks about Joshua trying to give the people rest, entering into the promised land. It talks about if we hear his voice today, we should not harden our hearts as they did in the rebellion, and therefore they failed to enter the rest. And you're going to see this in Hebrews 11, if you were to read all the way through, that we are a pilgrim people wandering through this world, seeking to enter a better land, a land of rest, which is, of course, glory. It is the eternal state, new heavens and new earth. That is the rest we are longing for, the heavenly city, as the author of Hebrews will call it. So, what's going on here then is the Sabbath, according to the author of Hebrews, is a type or a shadow of what Christ would come to do, provide rest for God's people, namely from their works, so they can rest on Christ's works. When they rest on the Sabbath, they acknowledge the need for someone to do the work for them on their behalf, salvifically. So, assuming that's all true, then the question is, well, that means the Sabbath is, of course, done for, just like the Levitical sacrificial system is done for, because Christ was the once for all sacrifice. We don't do those sacrifices anymore. The Sabbath was something that pointed to the rest that Christ provides, so we don't need to observe the Sabbath anymore. The problem with that, of course, is that this author is saying that there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God in the future. You and I, although we are justified as Christians, we are not glorified. We have not entered into that eternal resting place yet. That remains for the future, the ultimate consummation of the new heavens, new earth. And as we long for that final moment of rest, the Sabbath is a practical reminder of that future reality. When we observe the Sabbath, then, we are making a confession that we believe that there is one day, a time, where we will enter into permanent eschatological rest. What do we see the angels doing in Revelation and the people doing in the Revelation? Worshiping, praising God, communing together before the throne. That's what glory is. And that's actually what the Sabbath is supposed to be. It's a day for Israel to rest from all other earthly labors and focus themselves on worship towards the one true God. And in resting and focusing on worship, what they do is they confess, here is an inbreaking of heaven, a foretaste of the glories to come. And so long as we still await those future glories, we observe the Sabbath to look forward to that future and final consummate state of glory. And this is not special pleading, by the way. What is the point of marriage, according to Ephesians chapter 5? The whole point of marriage is it is the union between Christ and his church. It's a picture of the gospel. So since Christ has come and he has engaged himself to his bride and he's coming again to join her, well, what happens between marriage now when Jesus has ascended and before he returns? We stop marrying because the shadow and the substance? No. We continue to observe marriage and are encouraged to observe it more faithfully because of what Christ has done. By the way, no accident I'm picking those two, the Sabbath as a creation ordinance and then marriage as a creation ordinance, both pointing to the final thing of salvation between Christ and his people. So those are arguments from creation order. Now let me make some arguments from the Israel, what I would call the people of God order. Okay? So we read in Exodus 20 and Exodus 31 and Deuteronomy 5 that the Sabbath is a forever thing. It's a forever sign between God and Israel. Now, I'm going to especially plead here that you'll give me some leniency, and I'm going to say, okay, I think Israel is the church. Okay? I could make that argument elsewhere. We just don't have time to get there. If you debate that point, that's fine. Okay? I've already given you a previous argument to see, the creation order argument. But suppose that the church is the culmination of Israel, is all Israel was ever intended to be, because it's both Jews and Gentiles now wedded together in this new people. The Sabbath is then something for Christians still to observe, because it's a forever binding statute between God and his people, God and Israel. And again, that's not special pleading, because if you were to observe the other rights of Israel that are given to them to mark them off as the people of God, we observe those today too. Let me show you a couple of examples. First, I want you to turn to Exodus chapter 12. Exodus chapter 12. So the various cultic things that Israel did, by the way, cultic refers to like a religious observance in the ancient Near East. So the cultic system of Israel just refers to the Levitical sacrifices and all that goes with that law. Exodus chapter 12, and if someone could just read for me verse 24 of Exodus chapter 12.
I got it.
Great.
You shall observe this rite as a statute for you and for your sons forever.
Yeah. What's it talking about in Exodus chapter 12 is the Passover meal. The Passover meal is to be observed by Israel as a rite between God and them and their children after them forever. It's a forever statute. When they enter the land, they're supposed to continue to observe the Passover meal. It's a forever statute between God and Israel. Does the church still observe the Passover meal? Yes. What is the answer? How do we still observe the Passover meal? Communion, the Lord's Supper. Jesus breaks the bread and says, I am the Passover lamb. Or, as Paul will say, Christ, our Passover lamb, has been slain. So, do we observe the Passover meal as Israel did? Yes, forever, or until he comes again, through communion, through the eating of the Lord's Supper. So we observe the Sabbath, we'll talk about in the next session, not on Saturday, but on Sunday, as an obedience to what Israel was commanded to do, a forever statute between God and them. We observe the Passover, and by the way, the same kind of changes at work, where we no longer observe a bloody sacrificial meal, but we have an unbloody bread and wine picturing the final sacrifice of Christ. So we eat the Lord's Supper, we are observing the Passover meal. Last one, Genesis 17, is a picture of circumcision. The covenant of circumcision given to Abraham is also called an everlasting covenant. And if someone could read for me Genesis chapter 17, verse 13. Or sorry, you can pick it up in verse 12, but read through verse 13. Great.
He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring. Both he who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant.
Okay. There's no loss in translation here. Same underlying Hebrew text, same underlying phrase that's translated in English is an everlasting covenant, circumcision. Okay. How do we keep circumcision as a church, as people? Right. And by the way, for those of you who are Baptists, this is not a Presbyterian argument, okay? Baptists also say, many Baptists also say, covenantal Baptists would say, baptism is the circumcision that we observe. Now, they would say that, therefore, because of some of those covenantal changes, it changes who we baptize. But we have an explicit reference to this in the New Testament in Colossians, where it says, you have been circumcised in the baptism that you have with Christ. So this is not a uniquely Presbyterian argument. So I just want you to know you are in safe grounds here if you're a Baptist. And by the way, that's true with the Lord's Day stuff as well. So it's a covenantal theology thing is what it is. That's really the difference there. It's not a Baptist Presbyterian kind of debate. The point that I'm trying to make is we observe the Sabbath forever. And it's not just the Sabbath. We observe Passover forever because God told Israel to. We observe circumcision forever because God told Abraham to. And we do that as a people of God. We still observe the Lord's Supper. We still observe baptism. And we still observe Sabbath, as we would say. And now all of these, by the way, get New Testament counterparts. Passover becomes the Lord's Supper. Circumcision becomes baptism. And Sabbath becomes the Lord's Day. And I'm going to make a more extensive argument for that in just a moment. But I just want you to see the continuity then between not just the creational nature of these things. I think the creational argument is sufficient. But I want you to see the covenantal argument for these things as well. The people of God are to observe them. By the way, one difference to note, Passover is only to be observed by circumcised Israelites. So those who are under or have received the covenant sign. Circumcision is only supposed to be given to those who are of the household of Abraham. Sabbath, however, is to be observed not just by Israel, but also by all of the guests in the land of Israel. So wherever Israel has territorial control, they're supposed to provide Sabbath not just for themselves or for their own household, but also for all the sojourners among them. Which means unlike the Passover and circumcision, the Sabbath remains in the place of a moral law, meaning it's still for all people, not just for covenant member people. So even though it's a forever statute for Israel to observe, Israel observes it for the sake of all humanity. So there is a difference there. Okay, I'm going to try to very quickly deal with a number of New Testament references that all would fit under the rubric of what I would call objection texts. So texts that reference Sabbaths from Paul in a negative light. Okay, so we're just going to be able to look at one of them, and I'm going to, because I get to pick, I'm going to pick Galatians 10. We could pick any of them. We could talk about this in the Q&A, but Galatians 10 is where I want you to turn, and we're going to look at all three of these basically fit under a similar rubric. Sorry, Galatians chapter 4. There is no Galatians 10. Thank you, Eliana. Galatians chapter 4, verse 10. I feel vindicated. Verse 10. I knew I saw a 10 somewhere. And would someone like to read that for me? You could read verse 10 and 11. Yeah.
You observe days and months and seasons and years. I'm afraid I have
may have labored over you in vain.
Okay. So in context of Galatians, this is not some random reference to, oh, you take some days off of your work calendar. This is a reference to Israel's sabbatical system, where they observe days and months and seasons and years. The year of Jubilee, they're supposed to observe a weekly festival, yearly festivals, not just the Passover meal, but also the meal of first fruits, and a number of other sacrificial days, the Day of Atonement, are all supposed to be observed by Israel. And so what Paul is saying here is, you're observing all these things. I am afraid that I've labored over you in vain. So doesn't this just refute everything I said about, the abiding, continuing principle of the Sabbath, even for God's people? I don't think so. And for a number of reasons, I'll say this, but at least for the reasoning in Galatians, Paul says that circumcision and Moses, the law, was not good the way the Judaizers are using it. And I think that's basically the point he's making here, is the days and months and seasons and years are not bad. But the problem is the whole underthrust of the Judaizer heresy is that you observe this thing for salvation. So when he's saying you observe these days, months, seasons, and years, I'm afraid I've labored over you in vain, there's an inference in here which goes with the whole argument of Galatians that you do that for the purpose of salvation. Therefore, I fear that I've labored over you in vain. Because elsewhere the Judaizers say, circumcision, you must be circumcised to be saved. And Paul says, no. But Paul will say that baptism is important, right? And we've just said that circumcision and baptism are kind of parallels in the covenantal structure. And so the other two texts that I'm skipping, Romans and Colossians, actually are a little bit more on the nose, in that they reference Sabbaths. But Sabbaths is a plural, not a singular, not referencing the Sabbath day, but referencing the whole sabbatical system, and likely is a shorthand for the whole Mosaic system. So in both Colossians and Romans, where Paul rejects the notion of prioritizing one day over any other, it's probably also under this rubric of keeping the Mosaic law as opposed to being freed from that Mosaic law. But I've said already, the Sabbath is different from the whole Mosaic structure because the Sabbath is part of the Ten Commandments, not an extrapolation out of them. There's much more to say there. I haven't given this nearly enough time, but I just want to put that out there so you are aware. There are texts in the New Testament that would refute, and these are commonly referenced texts that seem to refute this idea that the Sabbath is a binding covenant for God's people. So I've given that as ammunition for you. And I'm just going to pause right there because that's as much as I want to say before I move on to the next stuff. So if you have questions, I'm happy to take them. All right, if no questions, I'm going to encourage you again to stretch your legs, and we will return in about 5 minutes to our discussion.